U.S. Marshals have just released age progression images of convicts who escaped Alcatraz more than 60 years ago.
For more than 60 years, U.S. Marshals have been trying to answer two simple questions. How did Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin escape from the most secure prison in America? And where did they go after the escape? Some believed they drowned in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay. Others believed they successfully escaped and lived out the rest of their lives in secret. But now, more than 6 decades later, the discovery of skeletal remains near Angel Island and the DNA analysis that followed have finally revealed what happened after the most famous prison escape in American history. And if investigators are right, the mystery that has puzzled authorities since 1962 may finally have an answer. But to understand this, we need to go back to the prison where it all started. The infamous prison. Alcatraz was considered the most secure prison in America during the 20th century. But long before it became the country's most infamous prison, it served as a military stronghold guarding the entrance to San Francisco Bay. When the United States acquired California in 1846, military leaders immediately recognized the island's strategic value. Positioned at the entrance to the bay, Alcatraz sat directly along the route that any ship would have to take to reach San Francisco. Whoever controlled the island could help control access to one of the most important harbors on the West Coast. In 1850, President Millard Fillmore officially reserved Alcatraz for military use. Over the following years, the island was fortified with more than 100 cannons, making it one of the strongest defensive positions in the western United States. Although it was built to repel enemy ships, it never fired a shot in battle. By the early 20th century, Alcatraz had already earned a reputation as being one of the most isolated places in the United States. When the federal government converted it into a civilian penitentiary in 1934, the infrastructure of isolation was already in place. What changed was the caliber of men sent there. Alcatraz wasn't designed to house every criminal. It was designed specifically for those who had proven they couldn't be kept anywhere else. If a prisoner was sent to Alcatraz, it meant the system had run out of patience with him everywhere else. Life on the island was extremely strict. Prisoners had to earn privileges that were given freely in other prisons. Their mail was checked, visits were limited, and every part of their daily routine was closely monitored. Over the years, some of America's most famous criminals were locked up there, including Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, and Alvin Karpis. Alcatraz earned a reputation as the toughest prison in the country, and prison officials were happy to keep that image alive. By the early 1960s, about 260 inmates lived on the island. Guards watched them around the clock, and regular head counts ensured everyone was exactly where they were supposed to be, which is what made the events of June 11, 1962, so unbelievable. Because on that night, 3 men would challenge the reputation of the most secure prison in America. The men behind the escape. On a cold January morning in 1960, a prison transport arrived at the Alcatraz dock carrying a new inmate. His name was Frank Lee Morris. Morris had been convicted of bank robbery in Louisiana and was serving a 14-year sentence. But what brought him to Alcatraz wasn't the robbery itself. It was the fact that he had escaped from prison before. The federal system had run out of patience with him and decided to send him to the one place that was supposed to be escape-proof. But Frank Morris wasn't an ordinary criminal. Federal psychologists who evaluated him recorded an IQ of 133, well above average, and far higher than most inmates around him. Morris had a habit of studying everything. He watched how guards moved, how routines formed, and how systems developed weaknesses over time. While most prisoners focused on surviving each day, Morris focused on understanding the prison itself. That patience would prove dangerous. Later that same year, another inmate arrived on the island. His name was John Anglin, a convicted bank robber. A few months later, in early 1961, his younger brother, Clarence Anglin, arrived as well, serving time for the same crime. The Anglin brothers came from a difficult background. Raised in poverty, they experienced a hard childhood and eventually drifted into crime. Like many young men in similar circumstances, they started with petty theft before moving on to larger crimes that ultimately landed them in federal prison. By the time Clarence arrived at Alcatraz, both brothers already knew Frank Morris from previous prisons. The connection was immediate. It wasn't exactly friendship. It was mutual respect. Each man recognized the intelligence, discipline, and determination in the others. There was also a fourth inmate named Alan West, a convicted car thief who had previously attempted to escape from another prison. Among the four men, West was the first to openly discuss an idea that all of them had likely considered: escape. He started the conversation and gradually brought the others into the plan. And together, the four inmates began working on a plan that would eventually take them out of Alcatraz. The secret plan. The escape plan didn't come together overnight. It took nearly 6 months of patience, secrecy, and careful planning. And before they could think about crossing San Francisco Bay, they first had to solve a much simpler problem. They needed a way out of their cells. At the back of each cell was a small ventilation opening. On its own, it was useless. The opening was far too small for a man to squeeze through. But Frank Morris noticed something important. The concrete surrounding the vents seemed weaker than it should have been. Alcatraz had a reputation for being escape-proof, but the prison itself was aging. Decades of exposure to salt air and constant moisture had slowly weakened parts of the structure. That weakness gave the men an idea. Beginning as early as December 1961, Morris and the Anglin brothers started chipping away at the concrete using stolen dining hall spoons and other improvised tools. Progress was painfully slow. Sometimes an entire evening of work produced only a small amount of damage. Eventually, they found a way to speed things up. Using a motor salvaged from a vacuum cleaner during prison work assignments, they built a crude drill. It wasn't sophisticated, but it allowed them to remove concrete much faster. However, there was a problem: noise. The sound of drilling and scraping could easily alert guards. Once again, Morris found a solution. During evening recreation periods, he played the accordion while the others worked. The music, combined with the normal sounds of the cell block, helped hide the digging. Between roughly 5:30 p.m. and 9 p.m., the men worked in shifts, with one inmate digging while another stood watch. Slowly, the openings became large enough to crawl through. To prevent guards from discovering them, the men created fake ventilation covers using cardboard and paint. During inspections, everything appeared normal. Once through the walls, they discovered something even more valuable: a narrow utility corridor running behind the cell block. Rarely monitored at night, it gave them access to hidden spaces above the prison tiers where they could work without being seen. It was there that the escape truly began to take shape. Over the following months, they collected and stitched together more than 50 stolen raincoats, creating a makeshift raft and several life preservers. To inflate the raft, they modified a stolen concertina into a hand pump. Then came the final challenge: time. If guards discovered their absence too quickly, the entire operation would fail. To delay detection, they sculpted realistic dummy heads using soap, toilet paper, paint, and real human hair collected from the prison barbershop. On the night of the escape, those heads would rest on their pillows, appearing to be sleeping inmates. By then, every part of the plan depended on every other part. The escape night. June 11, 1962, began like any other evening inside Alcatraz. At around 9:30 p.m., guards completed the nightly count. Nothing seemed unusual. In cells 138, 140, and 141, the figures lying in bed appeared to be sleeping inmates. As the evening progressed, the prison settled into its normal routine. Lights dimmed. Conversations faded. One by one, inmates drifted off to sleep. That was the moment the escape began. Shortly after 9:30 p.m., Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin climbed through the openings they had spent nearly 6 months carving into the walls behind their cells. The openings led directly into the narrow utility corridor behind the cell block. Because guards rarely entered this area at night, the corridor gave them access to a vertical pipe shaft inside the prison. Using the pipes as handholds, they quietly climbed upward through the building. The area was rarely visited by prison staff and never patrolled during the night. A few minutes later, they emerged into the cold night air. For the first time, they were completely outside their cells, but they still had to get off the island. By approximately 10:30 p.m., everything was ready. The raft was pushed into the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, and the 3 men climbed aboard. Ahead of them, the lights of San Francisco flickered through the fog. Behind them, Alcatraz remained completely unaware. The guards still believed every prisoner was asleep in his cell. No alarms had sounded. No search had begun. The prison that had held America's most difficult inmates since 1934 had no idea that 3 men had just escaped. The morning panic. The morning of June 12, 1962, began with a discovery that would shock everyone on Alcatraz. Shortly after 7 a.m., a correctional officer started the prison's routine morning check. As he approached cell 138, he called out to the inmate lying in bed. There was no response. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Prisoners often ignored guards or pretended to be asleep. But when the officer moved closer and touched the figure's head, something unexpected happened. The head rolled off the pillow. It wasn't a prisoner. It was a dummy. Within minutes, guards rushed to the neighboring cells and found the same thing. 3 cells, 3 dummy heads, 3 missing inmates. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin were gone. The realization was immediate. Alcatraz had just experienced what many believed was impossible: an escape. Alarms sounded across the island as guards locked down every section of the prison. Every inmate was accounted for. Every building was searched. But there was no sign of the 3 men. As the scale of the situation became clear, the search expanded far beyond the prison walls. Within hours, one of the largest manhunts in Bay Area history was underway. Coast Guard boats spread across San Francisco Bay, while helicopters flew low over the water, searching through the morning fog. Law enforcement agencies across the region joined the operation. Near Angel Island, searchers found a homemade paddle floating in the water. Later, a waterlogged life jacket was recovered. Soon after, investigators discovered a waterproof pouch containing personal photographs belonging to John and Clarence Anglin. To investigators, the photographs suggested something important. These were not men simply fleeing prison. They were men who might try to reconnect with family if they survived. Yet one crucial thing was missing. There were no bodies. No drowning victims surfaced in the bay. No corpses washed ashore. And without bodies, investigators were left with a question they couldn't answer. Had Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay? Or had they actually escaped? That uncertainty would become the beginning of one of America's greatest prison mysteries. The evidence nobody could explain. Within days of the escape, the FBI made its position clear. The water temperature in San Francisco Bay in June hovers near 50 degrees Fahrenheit. In those conditions, an untrained swimmer in light clothing would begin experiencing the effects of hypothermia within minutes. The Bureau concluded that the escapees had drowned. Fragments of the raft and life jackets recovered near Angel Island were cited as evidence that the raft had failed. For practical purposes, the case was closed. Except it wasn't. In 1979, the FBI officially transferred the investigation to the U.S. Marshals Service. Unlike the FBI, the Marshals were not focused on protecting Alcatraz's reputation. Their job was simple: locate fugitives. Because there was no definitive proof that the escapees were dead, the file remained open. And over time, that file began filling with information that didn't fit the official story. By the mid-1960s, rumors were already circulating that the Anglin brothers had been seen in Brazil. Family members later reported receiving unsigned postcards and vague messages that seemed to suggest the brothers were still alive. Then there were the roses. For more than 20 years, bouquets of roses appeared anonymously at the grave of the Anglin brothers' mother on the anniversary of her death. No one ever discovered who left them. In 1975, another intriguing piece of evidence surfaced: a photograph showing two middle-aged men in what appeared to be South America. Decades later, facial recognition analysis was applied to the image, producing high-probability matches to John and Clarence Anglin. Then came perhaps the most famous development of all. In 2013, a handwritten letter arrived at a San Francisco television station. The writer claimed to be John Anglin and said that he, Clarence, and Frank Morris had survived the escape. The FBI analyzed the letter for fingerprints, DNA, and handwriting evidence. The results were inconclusive, and so, decade after decade, the mystery only grew. For more than 60 years, the unanswered questions challenged the official explanation, until, in 2025, the mystery found itself back in the spotlight once again. The 2025 investigation. In January 2025, more than 62 years after the escape, the story took an unexpected turn. A team of coastal researchers conducting a routine storm damage survey near the northeastern shoreline of Angel Island made a discovery no one was expecting. In a sediment-filled tidal inlet, they uncovered human remains. The location immediately attracted attention. For decades, layers of mud, sand, and debris had accumulated in the area, burying sections of shoreline beneath several feet of sediment. Protected from the elements, anything trapped there could remain hidden for generations. What surprised investigators most was that the bones were found together in a single location. Not one set of remains. 3. And nearby were several objects that appeared strangely familiar. Investigators recovered fragments of clothing consistent with prison-issued garments from the early 1960s. They also found pieces of a broken wooden paddle that closely matched descriptions of the homemade paddle linked to the escape. Nearby were remnants of rubberized material believed to be consistent with the improvised raft Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had constructed from stolen raincoats. Suddenly, one of America's greatest prison mysteries was no longer just a mystery. It had become a forensic investigation. Over the following months, specialists carefully examined the site. The most significant evidence came from the remains themselves. Using modern mitochondrial DNA analysis, scientists compared genetic material extracted from the bones with DNA samples provided by surviving relatives of the escapees. According to investigators, the results identified the remains as those of Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin. The announcement made headlines around the world. At a public press conference, officials outlined what they believed had happened. The three men had successfully escaped Alcatraz on the night of June 11, 1962. Their raft had carried them across the water to Angel Island, supporting tide and current simulations conducted by researchers years earlier. But investigators concluded that the journey ended there. After reaching shore, the combination of freezing water, exhaustion, exposure, and harsh environmental conditions likely overwhelmed them. They had escaped the prison, but they had not survived. In many ways, the discovery appeared to confirm what the FBI had long suspected. The Bureau had concluded decades earlier that the men had drowned. What investigators never knew was where. Now, they had an answer. For more than 60 years, the remains had rested beneath the sediment of a tidal inlet on Angel Island. With the identification complete, the U.S. Marshals Service formally closed the case. The longest-running fugitive investigation in the agency's history was finally over. Yet, not every question disappeared. The alleged letter from John Anglin, the photograph reportedly taken in Brazil, the anonymous roses left at the Anglin family grave. The DNA evidence could explain where the story ended, but it could not explain every rumor, every sighting, every photograph, or every strange piece of evidence that had accumulated over 6 decades. And so, even with a final answer, part of the mystery continues to puzzle researchers even today. So after hearing all of this, what do you think? Did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers really die that night? Or do the letters, the sightings, and all the other unexplained clues suggest that there is still more to this story than investigators realize? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more crazy stories like this. We'll see you in the next one.